copy of the Dukakis campaign. Tom and I have just finished writing it, and it will be off the presses in August and in the bookstores by September, and I highly recommend it. Pequot Press. The first 100 days of any new administration is one of those arbitrary benchmarks that everyone, particularly the media, love to dwell upon. Why 100 days should be better than 75 days or 120 days or 1,000 days is beyond me, but it's a nice round number, and it gives us all a chance to step back from daily appraisals of a fledgling government still testing its little wings, to assess progress made or not made, opportunities capitalized upon or wasted, and if nothing else, take a measure of the operating style of the new chief executive. Those of you in this audience are veterans of government and politics and know that 100 days can be a lifetime or it can be no time at all. And you're also well aware of the risks inherent in premature judgment. However, that didn't stop all the major newspapers and television networks from weighing in with their assessments of George Bush's first 100 days in office. And he tended to get high marks for style and lower marks on substance. And there are definitely two very divergent points of view over this, depending upon who you supported in the last campaign, it seems. I think everyone does agree, though, that there are significant stylistic changes from the Reagan administration, not the least of being President Bush's greater accessibility to the press corps. Though as a reporter who's been covering these people for a long time, I should note that Reagan was unquestionably the least accessible president in modern times, and Bush's relatively greater accessibility still probably leaves a lot to be desired of an elected public official, at least from this reporter's standpoint. There is considerable debate about Bush on the substantive side. His critics complain that nothing much has happened, though the first dog did have puppies. They say that this president's opening days were marked more by inaction than action, and his few acts seem to be aimed at scoring PR points rather than addressing serious economic and social problems in this country. And then they say, too, that this isn't surprising given that he ran a relentlessly negative campaign that won him the election, but not necessarily a mandate. His supporters, of course, disagree with this point of view and cite many differences from a Reagan administration policy on both the domestic and the foreign fronts. And in any case, they argue that the country voted for continuity last November, so he's doing just what people wanted by keeping on the same Reagan-esque course. It's my job tonight to moderate this discussion, and I guess I'm supposed to do what wrestling referees do, ignore everything unless blood flows. But given that I'm a newspaper reporter and I like blood, I intend to avert my eyes if it gets that bad, so long as it stays entertaining. This forum is being taped for possible rebroadcast, and I'm supposed to remind you of that, so when your turn comes to ask questions, you're to be very pointed, and I will shut you up if you decide to give a speech. We will let Mr. Porter go first, another prerequisite of incumbency, to give his assessment of the first 100 days, and then Professor Edley will weigh in with what I hope will be a rebuttal, and then we'll go back and forth a little bit and then open it up to you. Take it away, Roger.
Well, it's great to see a number of familiar and friendly faces in the audience, and to be back at a school that I truly love. There are always assessments of these days, of the first 100 days of almost every administration. This is a tradition that dates back to the time of Franklin Roosevelt. In fact, the first 100 days technically refers to the period starting on March the 9th, when he called the Congress back into session after he had been in office for 5 days. At that time, we inaugurated presidents on the 4th of March rather than the 20th of January, so in fact he had 43 days more to prepare for taking office than presidents have now. But it's really an artificial benchmark that serves as an opportunity and occasion for us to assess how administrations are getting started. And I believe in assessing the Bush presidency and the Bush administration, one thing is very important to consider, and that is the context in which he came into office. Most presidents in the last half century who have been elected president in and of their own right have come into office at a time of perceived crisis. Franklin Roosevelt came in 1933 at a time of great economic crisis. Dwight Eisenhower, the next president elected independently on his own, having not served before, came in at a time when the nation was mired in a war on the Korean Peninsula and spent his first 6 months extracting us from that. John Kennedy came into office in 1960 amidst a campaign which was waged about the missile gap, Quemoy and Matsu, fears that America was losing its leadership in the world. The Soviets put up a Sputnik and we were suddenly in danger of becoming number two, and with the cry for a new frontier and to get the country moving again, that there was something fundamentally wrong. The next president elected was Richard Nixon, again coming in at a time of crisis with respect to Vietnam. In fact, in 1977, when Carter came in, it's the only time in the last 50 years when we've had a president come in at a time of relative peace and no demonstrable crisis, because by the time Ronald Reagan was elected in 1981, we had 21.5% interest rates, double-digit inflation, a great sense that something important needed to be done differently. But when George Bush came in January of 1989, there is no perceived foreign policy crisis. The world is at peace. There was no perceived great economic policy crisis. We're in the 77th month of an economic recovery. Inflation is down. Unemployment's down at a low level. There are a lot of quiet crises. There are a lot of concerns. There are a lot of anxieties on the part of the American people. But the notion that you are coming in at a time of crisis in which it is clear that dramatic action is needed is simply not the case today. Second contextual factor that's important to remember about the Bush presidency is that unlike Ronald Reagan, he faces a democratically controlled Congress with large majorities in both houses. That is framing the way in which he is having to approach problems. He does not have his own party in control of one house, which makes an enormous difference in the way in which policies get negotiated and legislation gets framed. And finally, again for the first time since 1929, we have a president coming in, elected, who is succeeding a party of the same party. Most of the time we have alternated with the 8-year itch between the parties, but on this occasion we have someone who is succeeding the same party, a so-called friendly takeover, which makes it more difficult to do what presidents typically do, which is frame their policies and frame what they are trying to do against what they were following, what they're succeeding. So I think in assessing this administration, it's important to keep those contextual factors in mind. Now, what has George Bush done, or what has he tried to do with respect both to style and policy themes? I think the first thing that's characterized his administration with respect to style is the extended hand. He decided very early on that it would not be possible to do what he wanted to do by adopting a highly confrontational nature with Congress. So in both his inaugural address and in his February 9th address to the joint session of Congress, one of the central elements and themes was, I want to work together, I want a partnership with you. Secondly, he has been remarkably accessible to the press. The number of informal occasions when he has met with the press in Washington, as well as number of press conferences, is exceeded by a multiple factor of several times that of his predecessor. He spent a lot of time with the public and an enormous amount of time with the Congress, probably more than any other president in the last 20 or 30 years in terms of informal visits, having them down. A lot of accessibility, very conscious and deliberate on his part. Third element is that he has undertaken a good deal of consultation. I was in a meeting yesterday with the bipartisan leadership where the subject of discussion was Panama. He had them down. It was a fascinating meeting. He had them down. He talked about some of the things that he was considering, indicated that he hadn't yet made up his mind, that he wanted their views, that he was interested in what they thought and how they viewed the situation and what they thought he ought to do. At the end of the meeting, he said that he would be making an announcement later in the day, but that he didn't plan on making the announcement for about 5 or 5.5 hours from the time of the meeting. And the Democratic leadership, in the person of Senator Mitchell, and Speaker Wright was also there, volunteered on their own that they wanted to adopt a ground rule, that no one would talk about what went on in the meeting at the time, that they liked the direction that he was planning on going, and that they intended on going back and drafting some statements of support that they would be glad to offer after it was over. One of the members there, who had been there for 25 years in the Congress, said, we want you to know we appreciate this meeting, and we want you also to know that in the 25 years that I have been here in Washington, we have never had a president who has been as interested in having us here on the takeoffs as well as on the landings. And this is a very conscious, deliberate part of his style, where he is building or attempting to build a lot of bridges between himself and those he's going to have to deal with in the Congress. A fourth and final element of his style is a willingness to get into details, to hear conflicting views, to cast widely the net of advice that he's going to receive, not only from within his White House and executive branch family, but within the Congress and outside. He does a lot of this on his own. You discover 2 or 3 days later 3 or 4 people that he has talked to on an issue reaching out. He is someone who likes very much to, in a sense, manage his own stream of policy advice and make sure that he is getting the kind of readings that he wants and that he likes. Well, what are the themes that seem to be emerging policy-wise and direction-wise in this administration? I think it's important to understand that George Bush, by temperament, is a mountain climber rather than a ditch jumper. There are a couple of styles of leadership, one of which might be likened to jumping a ditch. You take great leaps, you put out what some would call bold programs or plans. And the other is more akin to the task of climbing a mountain. You approach policy incrementally. You look at things over the long haul. You anticipate that you are going to be going back and taking a series of incremental steps rather than trying to do it all at once. And by temperament, I'm convinced that he is more a mountain climber than a ditch jumper. And as a result, I think when we assess his administration 4 years from now, that we are likely to find that we're quite a ways up the mountain, that we have traversed a lot of ground, but I doubt that we will have felt that there have been a huge number of ditches that have been cleared on the way. Now, what are the elements in this mountain climbing exercise? Well, I think that partly his task has been to define his administration and how it, in some respects, differs from that of his predecessor. And the first theme that comes through loud and clear is that of realism. Perhaps one of the most important decisions that he made very early on was what he was going to do with respect to a budget plan. The typical pattern for the previous 6 years had been for the administration to submit a budget that was promptly ruled out by the Congress as dead on arrival. And the principal reason it was dead on arrival is because the administration would make a request for defense spending, which was deemed unrealistic by the Congress. Congress would then cut the defense spending request by many billions of dollars, add in slightly less in domestic spending, and be able to make good on the claim that they were being more fiscally responsible. We had a long series of meetings early on in putting together the February 9 budget plan, trying to figure out what number to put in there for the defense number. And there were the conventional arguments that you would expect. Congress is going to cut this anyway. If we come in with a more realistic number, they'll cut us way down below where we really want to come out. And another set of arguments was if we come in with a realistic number, we'll be able to hold the line. There was a lot of divided opinion on that matter, but he decided to come in with a realistic number. And in fact, the budget agreement that has been worked out between the administration and the Congress and is being put in the budget resolution that will be completed this week was within $1 billion of the number that he came in with. It was a gamble that paid off. Second element of realism was the savings and loan crisis. The savings loans crisis had been around for 4 or 5 years. It was common knowledge that we had a very serious situation on hand. Within 20 days of taking office, he proposed a major savings and loan program that had as its hallmark a realistic approach to the problem. And it looks like we'll have essentially the administration plan put in place, been voted on by the Senate. It looks like we'll should get a favorable vote in the House soon and have that put in place. This realistic approach to policy is also reflected in what he did with respect to aid to the Contras. Here had been the most festering problem between the executive and legislative branches in the last 8 years, one that had served to create an enormous amount of friction and division between the two. He took what I think is one of the best negotiators that I have ever seen in Washington, Jim Baker, who went up to the Hill, spent 55 hours sitting around the table with members of the House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats, hammering out an agreement which all of them were prepared to sign on to. So the first theme that we have seen in this 100 days with respect to policy is this realistic approach to dealing with current problems. The second theme has been summarized by a phrase that seems to have caught on in the American public. They seem to, at least the polling data shows, that they identify with George Bush, and that is a kinder, gentler nation. He came up with a series of proposals dealing with Medicaid and child care and homelessness, etc., which again served to differentiate him from his predecessor and have as a common element the notion that we need to move toward a kinder, gentler nation. Even at a time of difficult fiscal restraint, there are certain things that are important enough that we get started on now and start on even if it has to be in financially in a relatively modest way. And then third and finally, there's the strain of programs that provided the bulk of the February 9th Building a Better America address that he gave that come under the heading Investing in the Future. He is concerned that as a country we need to be worrying now about what kind of future we're going to have in the 21st century, and that necessitates that we make a set of investments now and a set of changes now that will influence both the quality and the quantity of life that we will have in the coming years. And this is what is behind the proposals that he's made with respect to education and the environment, research and development, capital gains, etc. They all fall under this rubric of saying we're going to have to make some decisions now, some investments now, take some actions now, where the stream of benefits, while they may start early, will be relatively small at the beginning, but will extend further out. Let me close by sharing with you a personal experience about this and a conversation that I had with him coming back from St. Louis. We were coming back on a plane. One of the things that White House aides like to do if they're going to go on a trip, the reason you go on a trip like that is you think you're going to get some private time with the president without all sorts of other people running in and out, because it's hard to go anywhere when you're in the air for very far. We were sitting there talking about, I can't remember how we got off on it. We were talking about the Founding Fathers 200 years ago And I remarked that it was really, the way in which the country was found was really quite remarkable. At that time, we were a country of about 3 million people. We were huddled along the east coast of the United States. There were somewhat less than 200,000 politically active Americans at that time. And yet out of those 200,000, we had George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and James Monroe and Gouverneur Morris and James Wilson and George Mason and really Benjamin Franklin, a remarkable collection of people. And we were discussing what was it about that generation that caused us to create those kind of people. And I reminded him that there was a phrase that was used, a word that was used by that generation, a word that has seemingly fallen into disuse in our time, but a word which animated a great deal of what they were doing, and that was the term posterity. 9 times in one of George Washington's speeches, he uses the word posterity. The way in which they wrote, the way in which they talked, was that what they were doing was not for themselves, was not for their families, was not for their time alone. But what they saw themselves doing was for posterity, from this generation unto the next, even unto the 1000th generation, as Thomas Jefferson said in his first inaugural. And that it is that kind of thought and that kind of spirit, thinking about the future, worrying about posterity, that needs to animate this country. And I think you will see that kind of theme resonating throughout the next 4 years of the Bush administration. Thank you.
Right, okay. Well, I have a very tough job. I am so I want your sympathy. I am a great admirer of Rogers. I believe that he's one of the most able public servants and most thoughtful writers on the subject of governance in America today. My job is also difficult because I should not tell war stories, or talk about what the Dukakis administration would have done. I want to avoid the unattractive hubris of a defeated general telling war stories. But then again, I want to have fun. So, tell war stories. Tell war stories, all right. No, you'll have to. You have to wait for Chris Black's book for the war stories. The mood in Washington is decidedly upbeat today. I think that as I was making phone calls to people this afternoon trying to get some ideas to share with you, people are genuinely pleased about the way President Bush has handled the crisis in Panama, and the clear break with both the policies and the processes followed in the Reagan administration is a dramatic one and seems to be drawing considerable appreciation all around. So the mood is very upbeat. On the other hand, just last week the general tone seemed to be one of dismay, and dismay at the inaction in foreign affairs. And indeed, just beneath the surface of today's headlines on Panama are smaller headlines about yet another Gorbachev initiative, this one on short-range nuclear missiles in Western Europe, calculated quite carefully, quite ably to create still more disarray in NATO councils. And we still wait for effective leadership from the administration on that front, as do leaders around the world wait for effective leadership. We have a very able Secretary of State who has press relations that are perhaps second only to Roger Porter's in Washington. But press relations won't produce treaties, and they won't renew alliances, and they won't produce enhanced national security. It's going to require vision and some initiatives to match that vision. And that's really what I want to talk about, but not in the foreign policy or the national security context. Thus far, it seems to me what we have seen is a largely reactive method of leadership, much more what we would expect from a legislative body or a legislator, rather than the kind of vision or the kind of initiatives to match that the nation in fact needs, given the numerous quiet crises, as Roger put it, that we face. What we have to ask, I think, is whether the early returns, and it is very early in the administration, point to a style of making choices, articulating a strong point of view, rallying the public, expanding the envelope of politics to make new solutions possible, or whether instead what we see is a cautious and careful approach that accepts the political status quo, accepts a sleepy public in the midst of quiet crises. Ironically, speaking as someone from the Dukakis campaign, it turns out that George Bush is a manager. Roger calls it a mountain climber, but perhaps the easiest way to explain what President Bush has been doing is that he's been attending to the day-to-day problems of governance rather than to the challenge of constructing and articulating a vision that moves not only the Congress but the American people as well. I do want to give the administration credit for a number of measures that have been launched. For example, the S&L crisis. Well, I had nightmares about the S&L crisis during the campaign. I couldn't figure out what in the world one would do about it. If I were going to bet as to whether or not the Bush administration would tackle it within the first month or two, I would have bet against it. They did. I think it is to their enormous credit. Unfortunately, I can't for the life of me understand why the administration has threatened to veto the initiative on the House Ways and Means Committee to make the S&L bailout on budget and adjust Graham-Rudman accordingly. It seems to me that is a responsible fiscal approach. So a lot of credit for tackling a very tough problem that should have been tackled 4 or 5 years ago before it was a $150 or $200 billion problem. But they've made an important step. Third world debt, again, there seems to be distance between Secretary Brady and Secretary Baker. Can't tell yet whether or not the effort to distance themselves from the just make more loans, string it out kind of approach to one that really comes to terms with the need to reduce the debt burden, will actually turn into a realistic, fully detailed proposal. But there's some reason for hope. It is absolutely true that there is a fundamental choice about values and about the role of government at stake in the solution to the third world debt crisis. What I fear is that free market absolutism in Washington, which is not yet dead, kowtowing to the interests of the major profitable commercial center banks, will crush democracy in Brazil, in Argentina, in Venezuela, in Peru, and elsewhere. The hard test for the Bush administration of whether they will distance themselves from a free market, the government doesn't have to play a major role in this crisis. The hard test has not yet been passed, so we still have to wait, but they've begun. Finally, I want to say something about the budget and spend most of my remarks on that. Now, on the budget, again, I think some important credit is deserved. This was not a dead-on-arrival budget submission. It was a budget submission that was the beginning of a process of consultation and collaboration and effort to craft a bipartisan approach to deficit reduction. That, too, is a break with the Reagan precedent, the Reagan style, and a much-needed one. As you might imagine, however, my view is that it doesn't go quite far enough. I think my sense of the February 9th episode and events immediately thereafter is captured by something I caught in that great bulletin board of national public affairs, the National Journal, where Dick Darman, Office of Management and Budget Director Richard Darman, seemed a bit exasperated. Responding to criticism of the fiscal 1990 budget pact that he had drafted with key lawmakers, Darman said, "What we've done here is basically, with the first batter up in the first inning, hit a double." Sitting with Darman on the April 16th edition of ABC News' This Week with David Brinkley, columnist George Will said, "A more precise analogy might be that you're trying to steal first base." Well, I think that's pretty good. They're in the ball game. they're in the ball game. They've been creative with respect to process, but I'm not altogether sure that it marks the kind of governance, much less the kind of substantive policy choices that are needed for the country. What we see is a short-term political attitude on the budget, staying only inside the existing political constraints, rather than trying to bust through those constraints to reshape the discussion of fiscal responsibility and make tough choices. The administration, I believe, deserves far more than half the credit for the ridiculous budget agreement that we are about to see consummated on the Hill. Phony economic assumptions that many economists have termed the worst since 1981. And I would point out that it seems to me Congress, while certainly aiding and abetting in all of this, Congress does have a defense of being an inept institution. It's sort of, I guess we can't quite call it temporary insanity because it seems to persist. But there are disabilities there, and I think our best hope is the chief executive. Now, the original February 9th budget proposal was an exercise in, I hope this doesn't sound extreme, duplicity. Kinder, gentler stuff was highlighted. But it took most analysts a week or two to figure out what was really going on. After sitting down and doing the analysis, they saw the oceans of budgetary blood. The president's speech, although it emphasized kinder and gentler themes to the Congress, the fact of the matter is, then when he talked about increases over last year's numbers, he was talking about increases over a dollar amount rather than increases over a current services budget. When the analysts finished and they used the conventional measure of comparison, the so-called current services baseline, what they discovered was $700 million for a kinder, gentler nation, compared with $24 billion in cuts for the rest of domestic programs. When you compared the Bush proposals with the cuts that would have been made under Graham-Rudman, the result is that under the Bush budget, overall domestic reductions would total approximately $21 billion. Under a sequester, under Graham-Rudman, the domestic reductions would be about $12 billion. $21 billion under the Bush proposals versus $12 billion under the automatic sequestration cuts. By contrast, defense comes out much better under the February 9th Bush proposals. It essentially remains unscathed and does not materially contribute to deficit reduction. Under Graham-Rudman-Hollings sequester, defense spending would be reduced by nearly $12 billion. To put it slightly differently, the Bush initiatives constituted total outlays in defense 0.9% less than what Reagan's budget proposed. 0.9% less. In terms of domestic spending, 0.5% more than under Reagan's budget. This is not a dramatic shift in direction. This is better PR, and it is better process. Now, the creation of a new baseline was perhaps too clever by a bit. There is the serious risk that the short-term political gain and the short-term camaraderie with the besieged Democratic leadership in the House will give way as people recognize the price of deferring the real pain on deficit reduction. At least with the Reagan budgets, they didn't pretend to be doing something that they weren't. Now, I do believe that leadership on budgetary issues has to come from the White House, and it has to come from the president. I think this is simply a fact of life. It's not the way I would like it. I would much prefer to have leadership coming from Democrats wherever they might be. However, with the institutional disabilities that the Congress seems to have, we must depend upon the White House, and here is where it seems to me the mountain climber, the mountain goat, simply will not suffice. America is on a credit binge, a borrowing binge, an inability to look towards our future, towards our prosperity, as Roger put it. The only way for that to change, it seems to me, is with sustained executive leadership from George Bush. It is not going to come from Speaker Wright. It's not going to come from Newt Gingrich. It's not going to come from John Chancellor. It's got to come from the president. The stakes are enormous. We don't have crises, perhaps, in the sense of World War III around the corner, but those quiet crises are crises nonetheless. Dozen-digit deficits in trade and in the budget are robbing from our children. I don't want to indulge in campaign rhetoric, but the fact of the matter is that those of us who recognize the seriousness of public policy crises such as the deficit, the trade crisis, the third world debt, the savings and loan crisis, and on and on and on, those of us who recognize those bear a special responsibility to to step up to the challenge of shaping the public's understanding of those issues. As I said, changing the envelope of what's politically acceptable, what's politically desirable. Let me close by just mentioning 3 points that I think characterize the state of national policymaking right now. One, divided government. Roger made mention of it, and there is simply no doubt that divided government creates tremendous opportunities for malfeasance and nonfeasance. The blame for our process missteps thus far in the Bush administration are certainly not only those of the Bush administration. I recall vividly Leon Panetta reacting to chairman of the House Budget Committee, who I admire greatly, responding to the first few days of PR barrage following the February 9th budget proposals, saying, well, President Bush has won round one. But don't worry, we're going to come back strong next week. Well, I understand what he was saying, but the fact of the matter is that the appeal to a sports metaphor, the appeal to a combat metaphor, is exactly the invocation of a partisan style of governance that we have come to expect, that journalists have come to love and admire, but that I think does not serve as well as we try to address the quiet crises that face the nation. Secondly, apart from divided government, we have the reality of a PR presidency that is established by Ronald Reagan that will not go away, a set of expectations in the press, in the Congress, and in the public that the president will provide the kind of leadership that I've been describing. George Bush may be more comfortable in the role of mountain climber. The question is whether the country will follow a mountain climber, and the country very much needs a leader that it can follow. The PR presidency offers some limitations on our ability to govern, but it also, if pursued correctly, I think offers some opportunities, and I sincerely hope that George Bush will take advantage of those opportunities in a much more capable way than he has thus far. Finally, let me close by again referring to quiet crises. There are so many that it is indeed daunting. On November 8th of 1988, that is, there was a window of about 2 or 3 hours when the early exit polls seemed to indicate that there was just a chance that Dukakis could win. We were ahead in enough states to come within 30 votes in the Electoral College. It was just amazing, hard to believe. And I was panicked. Not only did I not have a good transition briefing book prepared, but I was clueless as to how to solve the SNL crisis or the third world debt. I had a few ideas about what to do about 40 million uninsured people without health insurance. And I knew a lot of people that I'd want to get involved quite quickly in coming up with formal solutions. And I was exhausted. And I really wanted to go to the beach. Well, for better or worse, I didn't have to give up my vacation on the beach, and I have not had any more nightmares about solving the S&L crisis or negotiating with Danny Rostenkowski on deficit reduction. But the fact of the matter is that the list of critical issues facing the country is, I think, more daunting and more challenging for our future than any comparable list in the last 50 years. It doesn't get written about enough. Campaigns are not too long. Campaigns are not too expensive. A 20-month campaign focused on political horse race coverage is too long. But a 20-month campaign designed to try to engineer a consensus on facing the nation's challenges is not too long. A $100 million campaign to elect the leader of the free world is not too much to spend. $100 million is barely what was spent by insurance companies fighting a ballot proposition in California on no-fault auto insurance. $100 million is not too much to spend. It's the tenor of our governance that is important. It's the tenor of our governance that's at stake, and I can't think of any better hands to put it in than Roger Porter's.
God, now what do I say after all that? They were both great. Yeah, I'm struck by an irony in this evolution of George Bush as the mountain climber, George Bush as the manager, because one of the things that we were all very aware of during the campaign, and Tom and I became particularly aware of as we were putting the book together and sort of going into the underlying causes of Michael Dukakis's defeat, is that Mike Dukakis himself had a very difficult time understanding, and some of us wonder if he ever got it, that the president is more than just the first bureaucrat of the country. And it seems that a lot of the disagreement now about how the president is doing gets back to that vision thing. And one thing I'm still wondering is the President Bush wants to have a partnership. That's fine, that's good. But to what end? He wants to climb. He's a mountain climber, but what mountain? I think a lot of us are still sort of wondering, where does this guy want to go? Does he have a specific idea about where he wants to lead the country, or does he have a specific idea, and for maybe temperamental reasons, stylistic reasons, and political reasons? I mean, the Democratic Congress and what I still believe is a real lack of mandate, despite an impressive victory, that he can't get there. So I'm not sure what the question is, Roger.
Well, let me respond to what I thought were a very thoughtful set of remarks by Chris with regard to this central issue that I think undergirds virtually everything the federal government's doing, which is the budget deficit. The way in which the 1988 campaign was run, both candidates, I think in an almost unwritten pact between them, were prepared to state that the budget deficit was a real problem, but neither of them was intent on pressing the other for a lot of specifics, for some very good reasons. As Chris and I discussed on a plane during the course of the campaign when I was teaching here and he was helping to manage Governor Dukakis's campaign and his issues, there are not a lot of easy solutions to that. And in the past, as a country, we have had a hard time doing difficult things in the absence of a crisis, in a perceived crisis. If you go back and look at the past 8 years, when we had these huge deficits start out, and then the times in which the political system seemed to summon the will to deal with them, they were inevitably at times of crisis. The October 1987 stock market crash, which got people to the position where we said, we have to do something about this. But George Bush came into office with a commitment to bring the budget deficit down according to Graham-Rudman-Halling targets and not raise taxes. And that limits the constraints in which you are beginning to operate. And no perceived crisis out there that the political system was willing to recognize in terms of both parties. And new leadership in the Senate and new leadership on both the House and Senate budget committees. And so he decided that the best approach to this would be an incremental approach in which we would establish a pattern of producing a realistic plan that would begin a process of negotiations, and that those negotiations would be followed by subsequent negotiations. Now, so far that's on track. We've produced a budget agreement for the first time in accordance with the time schedule set up and in the absence of a crisis. Got the congressional leadership in both houses and the president to agree to it. It does meet the Graham-Rudman-Hollings target for 1990, fiscal year 1990, whether you use the administration's estimates or CBO's estimates or the blue chip estimates. And the reason for that is that the way the estimates are on interest rates, but they're also off with respect to inflation and nominal GNP, and at the bottom of the line you pick up enough in revenue because we've got higher inflation and higher nominal GNP to counterbalance what you're getting on interest rates. So in fact, at the bottom line, at the end of the day, you still make the Graham-Rudman-Hollings target. You're within about $1.2 billion. It's a funny, quirky thing, but you in fact do. We are calling next week for a commencement of negotiations on the FY 1991 budget. We're not going to wait till next January when we submit a budget plan to go ahead. We're going to say, let's start the next round now. And we have every reason to believe that the Democrats in both the House and the Senate will join us. As Dick Darman said, we didn't hit a grand slam home run because we're the first batter up, and you can't hit a grand slam when there's nobody on base. You have to get some people on base before you can do that. And he claimed it was a double. George Will may have claimed he was stealing first base, but everybody agrees that the runner was not out, and whether you think he's on first base and got there by stealing, or he's on second base and got there with a legitimate hit, he is still there, and no one is out, and the process is continuing. Now, why are we being so intransigent with respect to the way in which the S&L crisis is being calculated? Which is a legitimate question. The reason for that is because the only discipline that we have in the system right now is the Graham-Rudman-Hollings targets. They're imperfect, but as someone said, they're the only thing that we've got. And they have committed both the administration and the Congress to a balanced budget by fiscal year 1993. In over 85 hours of negotiation on this package, I can assure you the only reason that everybody stayed in the room was because people said we have to produce something that meets the $100 billion target for fiscal year 1990. If that hadn't been there, you would not have been able to produce the budget negotiation that we got this time. Now, this is not a very bold, dramatic way of bringing down the budget deficit, to be sure. But let's be clear about the nature of the problem. 4.5 years ago, we were running a budget deficit, combined budget deficit, federal, state, and local, that was over 5% of our GNP. 2 years ago, it was 3.4% of GNP. Now, on a combined basis, it's 1.8% of GNP. It's below Germany is now. Germany's at 2.0. We're now below Germany. We have come an enormous way by this incremental approach, and there is no reason to believe that we can't have it down to zero by fiscal year 1993 if we keep at it in this way.
But aren't you paying a real price, though, for that incremental approach in terms of policy development, in terms of innovation, in terms of doing things that he might want to do that we still don't know about?
Well, if you believe, as I believe, and as I take it Chris believes, that one of the greatest challenges that we have, if the country is going to move forward, you have to increase the size of the pie. You can't be sitting here arguing about how we're going to redistribute. You have to increase the size of the pie. The only way that you can increase the size of the pie in an economy is to produce more goods and services than you were before. And that requires investment. And the great challenge that we have in this country is that we have an enormously low saving rate.
Exactly.
And by the government running a deficit, it is dissaving. Now, this year, we're going to take in about $82 billion more in revenue than we took in last year as a federal government. We have now, through this budget agreement, as a national family, pledged about $64 billion of that to reducing the debt. That is as if we as a nation were saving $64 billion more dollars. The biggest thing we can do to increase national saving in the short run is to reduce government dissaving. Now, the personal saving rate, for reasons that we cannot understand, has gone from about 3.4 up to 6.2% in the last 2 years. We wish we knew. I mean, I haven't found any economist anywhere who can explain why it has gone up that way. If we knew, we could double it, and maybe it would go up to 12%. I mean, I'd love to see if you could do it that way. But the personal savings rate is going up incrementally. But I'm still convinced that the biggest thing we have to do is to bring down government's dissaving or deficit, and that in the absence of a major perceived crisis, I'm convinced the only way our political system will do it is this incremental way. I had long discussions with Dick Darman, is a good friend, as many of you know, and we taught a couple of courses here together for a couple of years, and so we've spent a lot of time together. And despite any reports that people have read in the press, we are getting along famously.
You heard it here.
And he has said that his approach is we have got to establish a level of trust. We've got to give the new budget chairman, both who are coming out for the first time, reason to believe that they can control their committees and that they can preside over a process that works. And we've got to get them convinced that they can work with us and that we know how collectively to share the credit and accept the burden for whatever gets produced, because there's going to be some pain and there's going to be some credit in any program. And that's why he says, I think we got to double the first time out. Now, he knows we haven't gotten anybody around to home plate yet, but I would submit to you that that approach, given the context in which we're in, has the best chance for success.
I may at the risk of failing in my partisan role assignment, I find a lot of what Roger says to really strike home. I think that constructing a bipartisan budget process is absolutely critical, but there are some, but we do have some important differences between us. One is, I think that there has been an effort to really submerge some of the values that are involved. From the Bush administration's perspective, the word freeze, for example, has different meanings. When freeze is applied to domestic spending, it means constant nominal dollars. When freeze is applied to the defense budget, it means constant real dollars. We'll make sure that inflation is there. The focus on meeting the Graham-Rudman-Hollings targets, I understand completely. It is a function of the unwillingness of any of the political leaders around the table to take the heat for breaking out and saying, we need to change the targets, we need to change the process. The costs of that political timidity are rather enormous. For example, the present value cost of trying to accomplish the S&L bailout by putting it off budget has been estimated at what, $4.5 billion? $4.5 billion. It's not exactly chicken feed, but on the other hand, that alone certainly wouldn't solve the deficit crisis. But my point is, $4.5 billion is a lot of political protection money for the political leaders sitting around the budget table. Another point is, the rigidity of Graham-Rudman-Hollings forces a focus on outlay levels, which creates tremendous distortions in the kinds of budget policy choices that are made. Again, let me turn to defense, where the most obvious and perhaps the scariest example, where the pressure to reduce outlays forces cuts in readiness accounts instead of permitting the Congress and the executive branch to make reasoned judgments about canceling weapon systems. And indeed, when Secretary Cheney seems willing to sort of belly up to the table, if you'll forgive the image, and offer up a few weapon systems to cut. He doesn't seem, at least from press reports, it doesn't seem to have that much support from the White House, and we have George Bush deciding not between the Midget Man and the MX, both very expensive nuclear modernization programs. He wants to do both because, again, of fear of, I guess, disturbing the politics on the Hill, rather than, as I said before, trying to create a new politics around the solution of these quiet crises. I guess what I'm saying is that I am even prepared to concede that George Bush in his first year should not be expected to walk away from a no new taxes pledge that presumably was one reason why he got elected. Right? I think it's bad policy, but he got elected. We didn't. So I will concede that that sound governance probably comprehends George Bush clinging to his no new taxes pledge. Doesn't say much for our politics, but that's what we have. It still seems to me, however, that the range of choices that are available, the range of boldness that seems possible to deal with these quiet crises, is considerably more than we've seen inklings of in the first 100 days. I'm prepared to be optimistic about the next 100 days because I'm an optimistic kind of guy.
Well, let me just make one observation with respect to defense, because I think Chris has brought it up a couple of times, and it's a very interesting issue. For the last 3 years, the defense budget that he is prepared to do what needs to be done with respect to the bureaucracy in the Defense Department that has often resisted the kind of cuts that administrations have wanted to impose. We've got a whole set of programs that both parties have agreed are essentially off limits. When we talk about the defense side of the budget and the domestic side of the budget, we've got to remember there's a whole huge hunk in the center, which is larger than either of them, that for now, both parties have said we're prepared to have this set of programs fenced off. In my view, that can't persist indefinitely if you're going to have major reductions left. Mm-hmm. And that is going to take, I would submit, a great deal of courage on the part of both political parties if you're going to go after that chunk of the pie, since we've been trying to do it on these two elements, defense and domestic discretionary spending, and have been chopping away at those for the last little while. We've got to decide whether or not we're going to go for the heart of it.
Or we raise taxes in a progressive way.
Or have revenue...
As opposed to capital gains tax cuts for the...
Or have... Well, we can talk about capital gains if you'd like. Do you want to talk about capital gains or not?
Why don't we open it up now?
I'm happy to open up.
Capital gains could go on for a while.
Yeah.
I'm to remind you all that when you do ask a question, please go to the microphone because this is being taped for possible rebroadcast. And to ask a pointed question, since you all have degrees from this place, we know you're smart. It's not necessary that you show us. So whoever wants to start, go right ahead.
Thank you. I must admit, I am utterly baffled. First, I hear Professor Porter speaking of the success of the administration in making policy with the aid of Congress. Then we hear Professor Edley, his Democratic critic, replying that Congress, a Democratic Congress, is an inept institution. What we need is strong Republican leadership from the White House. If I may paraphrase Alexander Haig, who's in charge here? Do I detect a basic confusion about how policy should be made?
Chris?
If I had my druthers, or even some of my druthers, I would certainly have Congress operate in a way that was much more effective at defining it, setting it, following it, pursuing an agenda. In significant respects, the Democratic leadership in the House and the Senate have tried to do that, whether we're talking about minimum wage, whether we're talking about child care, whether we're talking about welfare reform, on issue after issue, the true leadership the true substantive leadership, it seems to me, has come from Congress. The fact of the matter, however, is that Congress has not been able to address effectively the great number of quiet crises that Roger and I have been talking about, and I believe there are significant institutional disabilities that make it, in the first instance, the responsibility of the executive to be forthcoming and to exercise leadership. Now, one can inveigh against the political timidity of members of Congress forever, and one can bemoan the rigidity of House rules or Senate courtesy, but those are realities that we've had for decades upon decades. What I'm suggesting is that in our system of government, it is, in this generation at least, the responsibility of the chief executive to lead the nation. It's not the responsibility of the Senate Majority Leader. That's why presidential elections are so important. Now, the American public made its choice, and we all have to live with that choice. What I'm in favor of right now is trying to see to it that the occupant of the White House and staff are as ambitious as possible. Moreover, frankly, I think that with respect to these quiet crises, the stakes are such that what I'm about is trying to encourage them to be successful. So I guess I didn't really come here so much wearing a partisan hat as I did with a critical eye.
Professor Edley, I guess, is expressing George Bush realism.
Well, it's always an interesting and useful question to ask who is in charge at almost any point in the life of a nation or a society or an institution. And I think the answer to that today is similar to the answer that I first learned many years ago when I started thinking about the presidency in a serious way at the knee of Richard Neustadt. He has helped us to understand that ours is a system of separate institutions sharing power. It is also a system in which, as Alexander Hamilton said, the presidency is viewed as the energizing element. I would submit to you that that is the way it's working today. The initiative, for the most part, is tending to come from the executive branch. It was the executive branch which laid out the budget plan that served as the basis for a negotiation. It was the executive that laid out a plan on the savings and loan industry, which served as the basis for a negotiation. This coming week, it will be the executive that is laying out a comprehensive crime package. In about 3 weeks, it will be the executive that is laying out a comprehensive set of Clean Air Act amendments, which have been stalemated basically for 8 years. But it's not the executive that's going to dictate the outcome. It's going to be decided through the process of a lot of negotiation between the two houses. In the bipartisan leadership meetings that we have had regularly, week in, week out, sometimes 2 and 3 times a week, it is clear to me, in fact, one of the things that amazes me is you get congressional leaders down there saying, we are looking to you for leadership, or we appreciate the leadership you are taking on this issue. But we expect you to negotiate with us on issue X or issue Y. And I'm not sure that that is not a pretty good way to make policy. I think that ours is a system which, however slow and plodding, is a system that makes fewer mistakes because it is a system that is deliberative and engages a large number of interests and a large number of institutions and a large number of people, and that if you look at it over the long haul, I would say that the pattern of policies that it produces on the whole is much better than a lot of the alternatives.
Next question.
Thank you. Gentlemen, there are some of us who did perceive the 1988 elections to be conducted at a time of crisis. And I think that those of us who are interested in American children considered it a time of crisis. Anytime 1 out of 5 is desperately poor, Over 1 million become pregnant. In our large cities, half of them won't graduate from high school. And in the nation as a whole, 4 out of 10 of them at 17 are semi-literate. I don't know about you, but for me that sounds like a crisis. Now, it's not as exciting as Latin American debt or saving SNLs or the deficit, but I think it has some relationship to that. Certainly it has a complete and direct relationship to our posterity. And nor does it lend itself to sports analogies and metaphors. But I think that this is something certainly that we should address as a crisis. And I'd like both of you to talk about appropriate strategies to dealing with the real crisis of American children.
May I begin?
Certainly, go right ahead.
Please. At a time of fiscal restraint, when you can only do a few things, you have to decide what your priorities are. And we spent a lot of time in putting together the February 9th plan, because there were people like me in the process which were saying, we cannot just walk in and say we're going to have to take all this money and devote it to deficit reduction. We have got to have a pot of money for new initiatives that reflect what this president believes are the most important things. Now, it may not be as big a pot as we would like, but symbolically it is going to send a signal about what we care. Over 45% of that pot of new initiatives dealt with children. It dealt with child care and a child care tax credit and making refundable, which means it goes to the lowest income Americans, making refundable the current child care tax credit. It went into Head Start. $3 billion of it went into Medicaid for women, infant, and children, pregnant women who were poor. The battle that we're having now on child care with the Congress is between an approach which is going to target funds to institutions, which is the ABC approach that's being championed by many Democrats on the Hill, and the President's proposal, which targets all of its money to the parents of children who come from the lowest income families. It is a much more specifically targeted program on low income. That was a conscious, deliberate, explicit choice by the President, who said, at a time when we can only do so much, we're not going to help people up to $44,000 of income. We are going to target the $3 billion that we have on this to individuals who have up to $15,000. They are the people who are hurting the most, and they are the people who need it the most. Now, the reality is we're in a time of tight fiscal constraints. There's no question about that. But I think it is significant that this president, in contrast to some of his predecessors, made the choice to focus as much of this discretionary set of new initiatives money that he had on the very problem that you raise, because that's where he feels it's needed.
My principal objection to the general approach that Roger outlined is the acceptance of the political constraints about what's required fiscally. A lot of it is derived from, on the one hand, the No New Taxes pledge, and on the other hand, from a commitment to a substantial number of defense programs that I think warrant tougher scrutiny. I think that there are other approaches that one could imagine. One could imagine a small tax on stock and bond transfers to deter churning in the market, speculative churning, that would raise $3 to $5 billion. You could imagine converting a whole variety of of import quotas into tariffs and using the tariff revenue of about $7 billion to make investments and to reduce the deficit. You could imagine taxing the portfolio income of foreign investors so that they'd be taxed on the same basis as U.S. taxpayers and raise $7 to $10 billion in that way. There's no shortage of ideas about how to raise money, and I think a substantively and politically astute use of new revenues, some of it devoted to deficit reduction so that we can improve our net national savings rate, and some of it invested in serious new, some of it put into serious investments for the future would be the best way to serve future generations.
I'm sorry to say this is going to have to be the last question because we only have 5 more minutes, and if it doesn't end promptly at 8:30, I'll be put on a blacklist or something awful will happen to me. So we'll go, just one quick question. Okay.
It is quick.
Okay.
Since you raised the issue of capital gains, I'd like to refer to it, particularly Roger Porter. I'm concerned about the timetable and whether, in fact, President Bush's reference to reinstituting a 15% capital gains rate a month or two ago is going through as you planned, and whether there's consensus between you and Secretary Brady and Mr. Darman about that timetable.
Well, the timetable on capital gains is dependent very heavily on the Congress. The President advanced his proposal. The modification that was made in the proposal that differed from the campaign in terms of what he put in was one that exempted people with incomes of less than $20,000 exclusively. Otherwise, it takes it down to 15%. There's a problem with the capital gains debate in this country, in my view. It's been obscured from the vantage point that I have by, unfortunately, tending to revolve around the debate about whether it raises or loses revenue and its distributional effects. And that's not the reason that the President is interested in the capital gains tax reduction, and it's not the reason that I think the country should be interested in it. Economists will disagree from the time they get up in the morning until they go to bed at night about the revenue implications of this. You can find respectable economists on both sides. We don't know who is right. There's a set of economists who believe that it will have a margin, will actually raise a little bit of revenue. There are a set of economists who believe that it will lose a little bit of revenue. They believe it with equal numbers on about both sides of it. We as an administration were quite happy to say, let's call it a wash. Let's call it neutral. Our budget plan did not depend on any revenues. The 78 cut in tax capital gains did produce additional revenue, and everybody acknowledges that. But the question is, will it do it a second time? And we said we believe it would, but we're in favor of it even if it didn't. Even if it was just neutral, didn't raise any revenue. Second thing is its distributional effect. You hear all these figures about capital gains is for people who have over $200,000. Well, if you go back and you actually look at who has capital gains, most of the capital gains that people get, they get when they sell their home, they sell their business, or they sell their farm. They have what looks like a big capital gain in a given year. If you look at their recurring income, over 70% of all the capital gains in the United States goes to people who have recurring incomes of less than $50,000 a year. The redistribution question is a red herring. Why are we interested in reducing capital gains? The simple fact is that this country is out of step with the rest of the world. The Japanese don't tax capital gains. The Germans don't tax capital gains. The countries that we're having to compete with and how they are raising their capital don't have any capital gains taxes. No one taxes capital gains to the extent that we do. The other countries that do tax it at a very low level. We are bringing ourselves into accord with the rest of the country, with the other countries that we're having to compete with around the world. And it is a measure, everyone agrees, that would produce some additional saving. And that is what this country desperately needs. We've got to have some incentives and devices out there to get people to save more. if we're going to have our economy growing. But unfortunately, it's revolved into a debate about whether or not it's going to raise or lose revenue, or whether or not what its distributional effects are, where I think that is not what we ought to be debating as a country.
In a nutshell, because we're running out of time, in a nutshell, I believe that the weight of the economic opinion on the capital gains is that it would lose revenue. But more to the point, the argument favoring a further reduction in the capital gains rate is driven by the same logic, the same supply-side logic that was used by the Reagan administration in 81 and 82, and produced the dozen-digit deficits and the crisis in net national savings that we're living with today. I think that there are progressive measures that one could pursue that would stimulate private savings, but beyond the technical argument among economists as to what the revenue impacts would be and what the effect on the savings rate would be, the fact of the matter is that this is an economic gamble. And all I want to point out is that the willingness of the administration to take this kind of gamble on our prosperity, as opposed to all the other forms of investment that one might imagine contributing to the future prosperity of the nation, bespeaks a choice of values that, well, they won the election. So, you know.
And on that note, thank you, Roger Porter, thank you, Christopher Redley, and thank you for your attention.